What if the most celebrated writer in American history took secrets to his grave? Secrets so explosive they could have shattered the fortunes of the richest men in the nation? In the summer of 1906, Mark Twain sealed an envelope containing pages he described as fearful things, meant for no eye but yours to see until I have been dead a century. The man who gave America its laughter, who made Huckleberry Finn immortal, who coined the very term Gilded Age, had spent decades writing in the shadows, manuscripts that named names, exposed schemes, and targeted the untouchable titans of industry and politics who built their empires on the broken backs of millions. This is not the Mark Twain you learned about in school. This is not the jovial humorist in a white suit spinning tales about boys on rafts. This is a man who watched America transform from a nation of promise into a theater of corruption, where senators could be bought for the price of a railroad contract, where children worked themselves to death in factories owned by men who dined with presidents, where the word democracy became a punchline whispered in smoke-filled rooms. And Twain saw it all. He documented it all. He named them all. But something happened to those manuscripts. Editors refused them, publishers delayed them, family members locked them away. Some were burned, others simply vanished, lost to history, or perhaps hidden by forces that had everything to lose if the truth ever surfaced. Because Twain didn't just write about fictional scoundrels, he wrote about real ones. John D. Rockefeller, Cornelius Vanderbilt, Jay Gould, the robber barons who built America, and the politicians who sold it to them. Tonight, we follow the trail of an envelope that arrived at a private detective's office in 1947, unmarked, anonymous, containing pages in Twain's unmistakable handwriting, pages that were supposed to remain buried forever. What was Mark Twain trying to tell us? And who wanted to make sure we never heard it? Welcome to the forbidden story of America's most dangerous writer. Before we dive into the shadows of the Gilded Age, hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to discover about Mark Twain will change everything you thought you knew about American history. And drop a comment telling us, what's one historical figure you think had secrets worth killing for? Let's go. The year is 1947. A private investigator named Raymond Schindler sits in his Manhattan office sorting through the morning mail. Among the bills and business correspondence, there's an envelope, thick, unmarked, no return address. Inside, 23 pages of manuscript, the ink faded but unmistakable. At the top of the first page, written in careful script, are the words, "For the eyes of posterity, if posterity has the stomach for it." The handwriting belongs to Samuel Langhorne Clemens, Mark Twain, dead for 37 years. But these pages were never meant to see daylight in his lifetime. They name names. They expose deals. They describe a nation for sale to the highest bidder. Schindler had handled mob cases, political scandals, stolen fortunes. But this was different. This was history rewriting itself in real time. Because what Twain had written wasn't fiction. It was a ledger of corruption, a catalog of crimes committed by men whose statues now stood in city squares, whose names graced universities and libraries. Men who had built America, yes, but on foundations of blood, sweat, and silence. Twain had watched it happen. He had been there, and he had written it all down. But someone had made sure it never reached the public, until now. The Gilded Age, the term Twain himself coined in 1873, was America's most contradictory era. On the surface, dazzling wealth, technological marvels, gleaming mansions that rivaled European palaces. Underneath, child labor, political bribery, monopolies that crushed competition like insects, and a working class that lived one paycheck from starvation. It was an age where senators were bought and sold like livestock, where a single man could control the oil that heated every home in the nation, where fortunes were made not through innovation, but through manipulation, extortion, and occasionally murder. And Mark Twain, America's beloved humorist, saw all of it. He mingled with these titans. He dined with them. He took their money when his own ventures collapsed. And he hated himself for it. But Twain also did something else. He wrote. In private, away from the public eye, away from his editors, who warned him that certain topics were too dangerous, away from his publishers, who depended on wealthy patrons. He penned essays attacking John D. Rockefeller's monopoly. He drafted speeches condemning Jay Gould's railroad schemes. He composed letters eviscerating Cornelius Vanderbilt's empire built on worker exploitation. He even wrote about the presidents, the ones who turned blind eyes to corruption in exchange for campaign contributions. These weren't jokes. These were indictments, and they were never published. Why? Because Twain knew what happened to writers who told too much truth. Careers destroyed, families threatened, manuscripts mysteriously lost in fires. So he made a choice. He would write for a future America, one that might be ready to hear what he had to say. He sealed his most dangerous work away, with instructions that it remained locked for a century after his death. Some of it did, some of it didn't. And now, in 1947, someone has sent a piece of that forbidden archive to a detective. The question isn't just what Twain wrote, it's who wants it found, and who will kill to keep it buried. Right now, before we go any further, drop a comment and tell us, which city are you watching from? Are you in a place where the Gilded Age left its mark? A railroad town, an old factory city, a mining community? Let us know, because what we're about to uncover connects to every corner of America. And we want to know where you're hearing this story from.
Detective Raymond Schindler didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in evidence, motives, and the greed that drove men to betray one another. But on that gray morning in March 1947, as he slit open the unmarked envelope with his brass letter opener, he found himself confronting something that defied his professional cynicism. A voice from beyond the grave that spoke with razor-sharp clarity about crimes committed in marble halls and mahogany boardrooms half a century earlier. The handwriting was unmistakable. He'd seen it before in the Morgan Library's collection, in facsimiles reproduced in literary journals. Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain. The pages were aged, the ink faded to sepia, but the words themselves burned with a fury that time had not diminished. At the top of the first page, written in that careful, slanting script, was a date, June 1906, and below it, a single line that made Schindler's pulse quicken despite himself. "These truths I commit to posterity, for my own generation lacks the courage to hear them." What followed was not humor. It was not satire in the gentle winking sense that America had come to expect from its beloved humorist. It was a prosecutorial brief, methodical and devastating, against the men who had transformed the United States from a republic into an oligarchy, and who had done so while wrapping themselves in the flag and clutching Bibles to their chests. The manuscript named John D. Rockefeller, the oil baron who had crushed thousands of competitors and built Standard Oil into a monopoly so absolute that it controlled 90% of America's refined petroleum. Twain's words dripped with contempt as he described Rockefeller's philanthropy as the perfume sprayed over a dunghill. He detailed how Rockefeller had bribed legislators, destroyed small businesses through predatory pricing, and accumulated wealth so vast that he could have purchased entire states if the Constitution had permitted it. But Rockefeller was merely the first name in a catalog of condemnation. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the railroad magnate who had built an empire on the backs of Irish and Chinese immigrants working 16-hour days for starvation wages. Jay Gould, who had manipulated stock prices and bankrupted thousands while dining with presidents. Andrew Carnegie, whose steel mills had become slaughterhouses where workers were maimed and killed with such regularity that the company kept a standing account with local undertakers. Twain wrote of these men not as captains of industry, but as warlords who had seized control of a nation through a bloodless coup, replacing democracy with plutocracy, while the public cheered and waved their hats. Schindler read page after page, his coffee growing cold on his desk. The manuscript was meticulous. Twain cited specific acts of Congress that had been purchased with campaign contributions. He listed the names of senators who had received payoffs disguised as speaking fees and consulting contracts. He described backroom deals in Washington hotels where the fate of labor laws and antitrust regulations had been decided not by elected representatives, but by men whose only constituency was their own bank accounts. But what struck Schindler most forcefully was the personal anguish that seeped through the prose. This was not the work of a detached observer or an academic chronicler. This was a man writing with the fury of someone who had been complicit, who had dined at the tables of these robber barons, who had accepted their patronage and their friendship, and who had come to loathe both them and himself for the compromise. Twain wrote of his own bankruptcy in 1894 when he had lost nearly $300,000, the equivalent of nearly $10 million in Schindler's time, on a typesetting machine called the Page Compositor. It had been a mechanical marvel, a device of such complexity and precision that it contained 18,000 moving parts and could set type faster than any human compositor. But it had also been a catastrophe. The machine broke down constantly. Its inventor, James Page, was a perfectionist who could never stop tinkering, who dismantled working models to install one more improvement, one more refinement. By the time the Page Compositor was ready for market, a competing machine called the linotype had already captured the industry. Twain had been forced to declare bankruptcy. His publishing house collapsed. His magnificent house in Hartford, with its 19 rooms and its ornate Victorian architecture, had to be closed. He and his family fled to Europe, living in cheap rented apartments while he desperately tried to write his way back to solvency. And it was then, in his darkest hour, that he had been rescued by Henry Huddleston Rogers, the vice president of Standard Oil, one of the very men whose empire Twain would later denounce in these hidden manuscripts. Rogers had been brilliant and ruthless. He had taken control of Twain's tangled finances, transferring the author's copyrights to his wife to protect them from creditors, negotiating settlements, and arranging for Twain to embark on a worldwide lecture tour that would eventually earn enough to repay every debt. Rogers had saved Twain's life, his reputation, and his family's future, and Twain had never forgiven him for it, because the rescue had come with invisible strings. Rogers never demanded repayment, never asked for anything explicit in return, but Twain understood the unspoken contract. He was now beholden to a robber baron. He had been purchased, not with crude bribery, but with genteel benevolence. He dined at Rogers's mansion. He sailed on Rogers's yacht, the Kanawha. He met presidents and senators in Rogers's company. He became, in the eyes of the world, a friend and confidant of Standard Oil. And with each dinner, each cruise, each public appearance, Twain felt the weight of the bargain he had made. The manuscript Schindler held was Twain's reckoning with that bargain. It was his attempt to speak the truths that his friendship with Rogers had forbidden him from speaking in life. It was a confession and an accusation, a eulogy for the America he had known in his youth, and a jeremiad against the America that had replaced it. But who had sent it? Schindler turned the envelope over again, examining it for clues. No postmark, it had been hand-delivered. No return address. No fingerprints that he could detect with his magnifying glass. Whoever had placed this document in his hands wanted it found, but did not want to be found themselves. He thought about the obvious candidates. Twain's only surviving daughter, Clara, had died just 5 years earlier in 1962. No, wait, he corrected himself, that was in the future. Clara was still alive in 1947, still guarding her father's legacy with fierce protectiveness. She had blocked the publication of many of his posthumous works, claiming they presented a distorted view of the man she had loved. Could she have had a change of heart? Could she have decided, in the twilight of her life, that the world deserved to know the full truth about Samuel Clemens? Or was this the work of someone else entirely, a scholar who had discovered the manuscript in an archive, a collector who had purchased it from an estate sale, or perhaps even a descendant of one of the men Twain had condemned, seeking to salvage a reputation by proving that the accusations had existed but had been suppressed? Schindler made a decision. He would treat this like any other case. He would investigate. He would trace the provenance of the manuscript, verify its authenticity, and discover who wanted these words brought into the light. But first, he needed to understand the world that had created this document, the Gilded Age, the era that Mark Twain had named and then spent the rest of his life trying to expose. He picked up his telephone and dialed a number he had memorized years ago. The voice that answered was elderly but sharp. "Professor Hastings, this is Raymond Schindler. I need to know everything you can tell me about Mark Twain and the robber barons, and I need to know it today."
To understand why Twain wrote what he wrote, you had to understand the America he watched being devoured from within. The Gilded Age, the term Twain himself had coined in his 1873 novel, co-written with Charles Dudley Warner, was not a celebration, but a condemnation. The title came from Shakespeare's King John. To gild refined gold, to paint the lily, is wasteful and ridiculous excess. It meant covering something base with a thin layer of gold. It meant deception masquerading as prosperity. And that was precisely what Twain saw when he looked at post-Civil War America. The war had ended in 1865, leaving 620,000 dead and a nation transformed. The antebellum America of small farms and local commerce was gone, replaced by something unprecedented in human history: industrial capitalism operating at continental scale, unrestrained by regulation, unfettered by moral qualm. The Transcontinental Railroad had been completed in 1869, linking the Atlantic and Pacific coasts and opening the interior of the continent to exploitation. Steel mills rose in Pittsburgh. Oil refineries multiplied in Cleveland. Meatpacking plants sprawled across Chicago. Textile factories filled New England. And the men who controlled these industries accumulated wealth that dwarfed the fortunes of European royalty. John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Trust controlled the lifeblood of the new industrial economy. By 1880, his company refined 90% of America's oil and owned most of the pipelines, tank cars, and distribution networks. Rockefeller had achieved this dominance through a combination of brilliant logistics and brutal tactics. He negotiated secret rebates with railroads, paying lower shipping costs than his competitors, and sometimes even receiving payments when competitors shipped oil. He bought up rival refineries, often forcing owners to sell by threatening to drive them into bankruptcy. He created a trust that allowed him to coordinate the actions of dozens of nominally independent companies, creating a monopoly that was invisible to the law until it was too late to stop. Cornelius Vanderbilt had built his railroad empire through similar methods. He had started as a ferryboat operator, the source of his self-bestowed title, Commodore, and had expanded into steamships and then railroads. By the time of his death in 1877, he controlled the New York Central Railroad and much of the rail traffic between New York and Chicago. His fortune of $100 million made him the richest man in America. He had accumulated it through stock manipulation, bribery of legislators, and the systematic exploitation of Chinese and Irish immigrant workers who laid track through mountains and deserts for wages that barely kept them alive. Jay Gould was even more audacious. He had attempted to corner the gold market in 1869, nearly causing a financial panic. He had looted the Erie Railroad, issuing fraudulent stock certificates and bribing judges to legalize his theft. He had manipulated telegraph lines to gain advance knowledge of stock prices. By the 1880s, he controlled 15% of all railroad track in America and owned the Western Union Telegraph Company.
And Andrew Carnegie had transformed the steel industry through vertical integration, owning not just the mills, but also the coal mines, iron ore deposits and railroads needed to supply them. His Homestead Steelworks was a marvel of efficiency and a horror of working conditions. In 1892, a strike at Homestead had ended with the company hiring 300 Pinkerton detectives to break it, resulting in a gunfight that left 10 people dead. Carnegie had been in Scotland at the time, leaving his partner Henry Clay Frick to handle the violence. But everyone knew whose orders Frick was following. These men had defenders. They called themselves captains of industry and claimed they were building America, creating jobs, and bringing progress to a backward nation. Carnegie wrote articles about the gospel of wealth, arguing that the rich had a moral duty to give away their fortunes to libraries, universities, and museums, though only after they had accumulated those fortunes by any means necessary. Rockefeller funded medical research and education, establishing the University of Chicago and the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. Vanderbilt endowed Vanderbilt University. But Mark Twain was not fooled by philanthropy. He saw it for what it was: reputation laundering, the moral equivalent of perfume sprayed over corruption. In his manuscript, Twain wrote with bitter precision about the cost of this progress. He described children working 12-hour shifts in textile mills, their small fingers nimble enough to tie broken threads, but their bodies stunted by malnutrition and their lungs poisoned by cotton dust. He wrote about coal miners in Pennsylvania and West Virginia who descended into darkness each morning, knowing that cave-ins and explosions killed thousands every year, and who could do nothing about it because the mine owners also owned the company towns, the company stores, and the local police. He wrote about the Chinese workers who had built the Transcontinental Railroad, dynamiting through the Sierra Nevada mountains, suspended in baskets on cliff faces, dying in avalanches and explosions at rates that were never officially recorded, because Chinese lives did not merit record-keeping. And he wrote about the political system that made all of this possible. The Gilded Age was an era of spectacular corruption. Senators were chosen by state legislatures, not by popular vote, and state legislators could be bought like cattle. The Senate was known as the Millionaires' Club because so many of its members were either wealthy men themselves or the paid representatives of wealthy men. Mark Hanna, a senator from Ohio, was so frank about the relationship between wealth and power that he once declared, "There are two things that are important in politics. The first is money, and I can't remember what the second one is." The most famous scandal of the era was the Credit Mobilier affair, which erupted during the Grant administration. The Union Pacific Railroad had created a construction company called Credit Mobilier and then hired itself to build the Transcontinental Railroad at wildly inflated prices. The profits from this fraud were enormous, and to prevent investigation, the company distributed stock to key members of Congress, including the Vice President, Schuyler Colfax, and James Garfield, who would later become president. When the scheme was exposed in 1872, the public was outraged, but almost no one faced serious consequences. 2 congressmen were censured. No one went to prison. The railroad barons kept their fortunes. Twain had watched all of this with growing fury. He had been born in 1835 in Missouri,
a slave state, and had grown up in Hannibal, a small river town where everyone knew everyone, and a man's reputation mattered more than his bank account. He had worked as a typesetter, a riverboat pilot, a silver prospector, and a journalist before becoming a writer. He had known poverty. He had known honest work. And he had known a version of America that still believed, however imperfectly, in the principles it claimed to honor. By the 1890s, that America was gone. In its place was something that called itself a republic, but functioned as an oligarchy. Elections were held, yes, but the candidates were chosen by party bosses, who answered to industrial magnates. Newspapers were ostensibly free, but their owners depended on advertising revenue from corporations that would withdraw their support if coverage became too critical. Universities taught economics, but many were funded by the very robber barons whose practices should have been the subject of critical scrutiny. Even religion had been corrupted. The social gospel movement preached that poverty was a moral failing and wealth a sign of God's favor. Ministers like Russell Conwell delivered sermons with titles like Acres of Diamonds, assuring their congregations that anyone could become rich if they worked hard enough, and implying that those who remained poor deserved their fate. Twain found this particularly nauseating. He had lost his own fortune not through laziness, but through bad luck and misplaced trust. He knew that the American dream of self-made success was largely a myth, that most fortunes were built on inheritance, insider knowledge, or outright theft. He knew that hard work was more likely to result in an early death than in wealth. And he knew that the men who preached the gospel of wealth had themselves inherited fortunes or built them through methods they would never admit in public. This was the world that had created the manuscript Schindler held. This was the system that Twain could not publicly condemn because he depended on it for his survival. His books sold to middle-class readers who wanted to believe in American exceptionalism. His lecture tours were arranged by booking agents who depended on the goodwill of wealthy patrons. His rescue from bankruptcy had been orchestrated by a man who epitomized everything Twain despised about the Gilded Age. He was trapped in a gilded cage of his own making, and so he wrote in secret, pouring his rage onto pages he knew would never be published in his lifetime, preserving his testimony for a future he hoped would be wiser and braver than his own era.
The relationship between Mark Twain and Henry Huddleston Rogers was one of the strangest friendships in American history. A bond between a satirist and a robber baron, a man who made his living exposing hypocrisy, and a man who had built his fortune on ruthless business practices that destroyed competitors and enriched stockholders. And yet, by all accounts, it was genuine. They met in September 1893, introduced by a mutual acquaintance at a time when Twain's financial situation had become desperate. Rogers was 53 years old, the vice president of Standard Oil, and one of the most powerful men in America. He had a reputation for being relentless, ravenous, ruthless as a shark, according to one critic. On Wall Street, his enemies called him Hellhound Rogers. But he also had charm, wit, and a soft spot for artists and writers. When Rogers learned the extent of Twain's financial troubles, he took action with the efficiency of a general mobilizing an army. Within weeks, he had analyzed every debt, every contract, every potential asset. He discovered that Twain's publishing house, Charles L. Webster and Company, had liabilities of nearly $100,000 against assets of less than $70,000. The company had made a fortune publishing Ulysses S. Grant's memoirs in 1885, but subsequent publications had been disasters. A biography of Pope Leo XIII had sold fewer than 200 copies. The firm was insolvent. Rogers also discovered that Twain had poured $300,000 into the Page Compositor over more than a decade, convinced that it would revolutionize publishing and make him wealthy beyond imagination. But the machine was a failure. Brilliant in conception, catastrophic in execution. Its 18,000 parts made it nearly impossible to maintain. Its perfectionist inventor, James Page, had delayed production for years while he made endless refinements. By 1894, the competing linotype machine had captured the market, and the Page Compositor was worthless. Rogers moved decisively. In March 1894, he advised Twain to transfer all copyrights to his wife, Olivia Langdon Clemens, to protect them from creditors. Then, in April, Twain filed for bankruptcy. The headlines were brutal. Mark Twain is ruined, and Failure of Mark Twain. Critics sneered that he was in business, just a big overgrown boy. Some whispered that the asset transfer was fraudulent. But Rogers had calculated correctly. The bankruptcy gave Twain legal protection, and the copyright transfer ensured that his future earnings would not be seized. Then came Rogers' most audacious move. He proposed that Twain embark on a worldwide lecture tour, something no American author had attempted on such a scale. The tour would take him to the British colonies, Australia, New Zealand, India, South Africa, where English-speaking audiences would pay to hear America's most famous humorist.
The proceeds would go directly to repaying creditors. Twain was 60 years old, exhausted, grieving the recent death of his daughter Susie from meningitis. But he had no choice. He needed the money, and he needed to restore his reputation. In July 1895, he left Elmira, New York, and began a grueling schedule that would span 14 months, with 122 performances in 71 cities across 5 continents. The tour was a triumph. Audiences packed theaters to hear Twain's stories and jokes. Critics praised his delivery. The money rolled in, enough to repay every creditor in full, even though the bankruptcy meant he had no legal obligation to do so. By 1898, Twain was solvent again. His reputation as a man of honor was restored, and all of it was due to Henry Rogers. But there was a cost, and Twain understood it perfectly. He was now associated with Standard Oil, one of the most hated corporations in America. Journalists and reformers who might have sought his support in attacking the trusts now saw him as compromised. And worse, Twain genuinely liked Rogers. The man was brilliant, funny, and generous. He and his wife, Abby, treated Twain like family. They invited him to their townhouse in New York, their 48-room mansion in Fairhaven, Massachusetts, and aboard their steam yacht, the Kanawha.
Rogers never mentioned the debt Twain owed him, never asked for anything in return. But Twain was not naive. He understood that the friendship served Rogers's interests. It gave Standard Oil a respectable face, an association with America's beloved humorist. It suggested that if Mark Twain could be friends with a robber baron, then perhaps the robber barons were not so bad after all. And Twain hated himself for being part of that calculation. In the manuscript Detective Schindler was reading, Twain wrote about this moral compromise with savage honesty. He described dining with Rogers and other industrialists, listening to them discuss labor strikes and government regulations as if they were military campaigns to be won through superior force. He wrote about sailing on the Kanawha and seeing other wealthy men's yachts in the harbor, each one a floating palace that cost more than 1,000 workers would earn in their lifetimes. He wrote about attending dinners where senators and judges mingled with businessmen, where deals were made with handshakes and winks, where the fate of industries and the lives of millions of workers were decided over brandy and cigars. And he wrote about his own complicity. He could have refused Rogers's help. He could have declared bankruptcy and walked away, letting his creditors fight over the scraps. But he had been too proud for that. He had wanted to repay every debt, to prove that he was a man of honor. And in doing so, he had made himself beholden to the very system he despised. Twain also saw with painful clarity how Rogers and men like him justified their actions. They genuinely believed they were building America.
They pointed to the railroads that connected the continent, the factories that produced goods more cheaply than ever before, the jobs that drew millions of immigrants to American shores. They believed in progress, in efficiency, in the triumph of reason over superstition. And they believed that their wealth was evidence of their virtue, proof that they had outworked and outsmarted their competitors. But Twain knew the truth behind the rhetoric. He had seen the human cost of that progress. He had traveled through mining towns where men coughed up coal dust and died before they reached 40. He had visited factory towns where children worked 60-hour weeks for pennies. He had read reports of railroad accidents that killed workers by the dozen, and of corporate lawyers who argued in court that the deaths were the workers' own fault for being careless. He had watched as strikes were broken by private armies of Pinkertons and state militias, as workers who demanded living wages were shot down in the streets, as union organizers were blacklisted and their families starved. And he had seen how the system protected itself. When journalists like Ida Tarbell wrote exposés of Standard Oil's practices, Rogers and his colleagues responded with charm and selective disclosure, admitting minor faults while concealing major crimes. When legislators proposed antitrust laws, Standard Oil hired the best lawyers in the country to find loopholes and delays. When public outrage grew too intense, the company made strategic concessions, donating to charity, improving working conditions in a few highly visible facilities, launching public relations campaigns that emphasized their contributions to American prosperity. It was a brilliant strategy, and it worked. Despite decades of criticism, despite antitrust lawsuits and muckraking journalism, Standard Oil remained largely intact until 1911, when the Supreme Court finally ordered its dissolution.
And even then, the company simply reorganized into separate entities that continued to be controlled by the same people and continued to generate enormous profits. Twain's friendship with Rogers lasted until the latter's death in May 1909. Twain was on his way to visit Rogers in New York when he received the news at Grand Central Terminal. He was devastated. Rogers had been, in Twain's words, "the best friend I have ever had, the nearest perfect, as man and gentleman, I have yet met among my race." 2 days later, Twain served as an honorary pallbearer at Rogers's funeral. But he declined to accompany the funeral train to Fairhaven for the burial, saying, "I cannot bear to travel with my friend and not converse." It was a characteristically Twainian remark, witty, melancholy, and revealing. Because the truth was that Twain could never really converse with Rogers about the things that mattered most. He could never tell his friend that he despised the system Rogers represented. He could never admit that every dinner, every yacht cruise, every act of generosity deepened the moral compromise that was eating away at his soul. And so he wrote instead, in secret, for an audience that would not read his words until everyone involved was safely dead. Twain's friendship with Rogers lasted until the latter's death in May 1909. Twain was on his way to visit Rogers in New York when he received the news at Grand Central Terminal. He was devastated. Rogers had been, in Twain's words, "the best friend I have ever had, the nearest perfect, as man and gentleman, I have yet met among my race." 2 days later, Twain served as an honorary pallbearer at Rogers's funeral. But he declined to accompany the funeral train to Fairhaven for the burial, saying, "I cannot bear to travel with my friend and not converse." It was a characteristically Twainian remark, witty, melancholy, and revealing. Because the truth was that Twain could never really converse with Rogers about the things that mattered most. He could never tell his friend that he despised the system Rogers represented. He could never admit that every dinner, every yacht cruise, every act of generosity deepened the moral compromise that was eating away at his soul. And so he wrote instead, in secret, for an audience that would not read his words until everyone involved was safely dead.
The manuscript that arrived at Detective Schindler's office was not the only document Twain had written with the intention of posthumous publication. As Schindler began researching Twain's suppressed writings, he discovered a pattern, a lifetime of work that the author had deliberately withheld, knowing it was too dangerous, too blasphemous, or too true for contemporary audiences. The most famous of these was Letters from the Earth, a devastating satire written in 1909, the year before Twain's death. In it, Twain imagined Satan banished to Earth and writing letters back to the archangels, Michael and Gabriel, describing the bizarre creatures he had discovered, human beings. The premise allowed Twain to attack Christianity with a ferocity he had never dared to display in his published work. Satan marveled at humans who claimed to worship a loving God, but filled their holy book with accounts of genocide, slavery, and eternal torture. He ridiculed the concept of heaven as a place of eternal harp playing and hymn singing, pointing out that most humans couldn't carry a tune and found church services boring after an hour, yet claimed to want an eternity of the same. He exposed the contradictions in biblical morality,
noting that humans condemn adultery while their God commanded the slaughter of entire cities, sparing only the virgin girls to be distributed among the victors. Twain's daughter Clara had blocked the publication of Letters from the Earth when it was first proposed in 1939. She claimed it presented a distorted view of her father and would damage his reputation. The manuscript remained unpublished until 1962, more than 50 years after Twain's death, when Clara finally relented. Partly because the Soviet Union had begun claiming that America was suppressing Twain's ideas, and partly because she realized that public attitudes toward religion had shifted enough to make the work publishable. But Letters from the Earth was only one example. There was The War Prayer, written in 1905, a short piece that depicted a church service during wartime. A congregation prays for victory, asking God to bless their soldiers and grant them triumph over the enemy. Then a mysterious stranger appears and explains what they are really praying for: that God will help their soldiers tear enemy soldiers to pieces with shrapnel, leave enemy children orphaned and starving, turn enemy villages into smoking ruins, and fill enemy hospitals with the mutilated and dying. The prayer, when stripped of euphemism, is revealed as a petition for mass murder. Twain submitted the war prayer to Harper's Bazaar, but his family and friends convinced him to withdraw it. His publisher told him, "Only dead men can tell the truth in this world." Twain agreed and locked the manuscript away. There was What is Man?, a philosophical dialogue that Twain considered his most important work. In it, he argued that human beings were nothing more than machines, responding to stimuli according to predetermined programming. Free will was an illusion. Morality was simply self-interest dressed in noble language. Every action, every thought, every emotion was the inevitable result of genetics and environment. There was no soul, no divine spark, no higher purpose. Twain knew this work would be seen as deeply heretical, so he published it anonymously in 1906 in an edition of just 250 copies. It was not published under his name until after his death. There was The Mysterious Stranger, a novella that existed in 3 different unfinished versions. In it, an angel named Satan, nephew of the Satan, visits Earth and demonstrates his powers to a group of boys. He creates miniature people and then casually destroys them. He explains that human beings are insignificant, that their morality is arbitrary, that their suffering means nothing to the universe. The story was dark, nihilistic, and deeply pessimistic about human nature. After Twain's death, his literary executor, Albert Bigelow Paine, heavily edited and substantially rewrote the material, creating a published version that bore little resemblance to what Twain had actually written. The original versions were not published until the 1960s. And then there was the autobiography itself, the massive, sprawling, undisciplined collection of reminiscences that Twain dictated in his final years. He had begun working on an autobiography as early as the 1870s, but he had never been satisfied with the traditional chronological format. It felt artificial, forced. In 1906, at age 70, he finally discovered a method that suited him. He would simply talk, rambling from topic to topic, dictating whatever came to mind on any given day. His secretary, Josephine Hobby, took down his words in shorthand, and his biographer, Albert Bigelow Paine, listened and occasionally prompted him with questions. Over 4 years, Twain dictated nearly 5,000 pages. Not a conventional autobiography, but something more like a diary, a blog, a stream of consciousness that ranged from childhood memories to bitter denunciations of contemporary figures. And he made one crucial decision. The autobiography would not be published in full for 100 years after his death. He wanted to speak with his whole frank mind, without worrying about the consequences. He wanted to name names, settle scores, expose frauds. He wanted to tell the truth about his bankruptcy, his friendships with robber barons, his religious doubts, his contempt for Theodore Roosevelt, whom he called the Tom Sawyer of the political world, his fury at the American invasion of the Philippines, his bitterness about the deaths of his wife and daughters. But he also knew that publishing such material during his lifetime, or even immediately after his death, would destroy his reputation and hurt people he loved. So he imposed the century-long embargo, gambling that future generations would be more tolerant and more interested in truth than in comfortable myths. The gamble paid off. When the first volume of the autobiography was finally published in 2010, exactly 100 years after Twain's death, it became an immediate bestseller. Readers discovered a Twain they had never known, angrier, more complex, more vulnerable than the genial humorist of popular imagination. But in 1947, when Detective Schindler was investigating the mysterious manuscript, the autobiography was still locked away in the archives at the University of California, Berkeley. Clara Clemens was still alive, still guarding her father's legacy. The world was not yet ready for the full truth about Mark Twain. Which made Schindler wonder, if this manuscript was genuine, how had it escaped Clara's control? Who had access to Twain's papers? And why had they chosen to send it to a private detective rather than a publisher or a scholar? The more Schindler learned about Twain's suppressed writings, the more he realized that the manuscript he had received was not an isolated document. It was part of a larger pattern, a lifetime's accumulation of forbidden truths. Twain had not simply written about the Gilded Age. He had lived through it, profited from it, been corrupted by it, and then spent his final years documenting his own moral compromise. He had created a time capsule filled with testimonies that would only be opened after everyone involved was safely dead. But someone had decided not to wait. Someone had decided that 1947 was the right time for these truths to emerge. And Schindler intended to find out who and why.
As Schindler dug deeper into the mystery, he began to understand that Twain's silence during his lifetime had not been simple cowardice. It had been a calculated survival strategy in an era when speaking truth to power could destroy not just a career, but an entire family. The case of Ida Tarbell illustrated what happened to those who dared to expose the robber barons. Tarbell was a journalist who had published a devastating series of articles in McClure's magazine from 1902 to 1904, documenting Standard Oil's predatory business practices. Her research was meticulous. She interviewed former Standard Oil employees, examined court records, obtained secret company documents. She described how Rockefeller had used railroad rebates to undercut competitors, how he had bribed legislators, how he had sent spies to gather intelligence on rival companies, how he had systematically crushed anyone who stood in his way.
The series was eventually published as a book, The History of the Standard Oil Company, and it became one of the most important works of muckraking journalism in American history. It helped build public support for antitrust action and contributed to the eventual breakup of Standard Oil in 1911. But Tarbell paid a price. Standard Oil launched a campaign to discredit her, calling her a hysterical woman with a personal vendetta. They were not entirely wrong. Tarbell's own father had been an oil producer whose business was destroyed by Standard Oil's practices. But her research was solid, and her conclusions were accurate. Nevertheless, the attack on her reputation was vicious and persistent. Rockefeller's defenders portrayed her as a bitter spinster who resented successful men. And here was the twist that Schindler found particularly interesting. Twain had known Ida Tarbell. In fact, he had introduced her to Henry Rogers. It was one of the strangest relationships in the story. Rogers had agreed to be interviewed by Tarbell, apparently believing he could charm her into writing a favorable account. Instead, she had written the exposé that would help destroy his company. But Rogers and Twain remained friends. Rogers never blamed Twain for the introduction. They continued to dine together, to cruise on the Kanawha, to exchange letters filled with jokes and affection. It was as if they had all agreed to pretend that business and personal relationships existed in separate spheres, that you could simultaneously expose a man's crimes and enjoy his hospitality. But Twain understood the real lesson. Tarbell had been able to publish her exposé only because she worked for McClure's magazine, which was financially independent of the oil industry. Most newspapers and magazines depended on advertising revenue from corporations that would withdraw their support if coverage became too critical.
Publishers who challenged the robber barons found themselves unable to secure loans, unable to distribute their publications, unable to compete. The entire media ecosystem was captured, not through crude censorship, but through the subtler mechanism of economic dependence. Twain had experienced this firsthand with his own publishing house. Charles L. Webster and Company had initially succeeded because it published Ulysses S. Grant's memoirs, which became a massive bestseller. But when the company tried to publish other works that might offend powerful interests, it found itself unable to secure favorable distribution deals, unable to get reviewed in major newspapers, unable to attract quality authors. The company had failed not just because of mismanagement, but because it lacked the connections and protections that came from being part of the establishment. And that was why Twain could not publish his denunciations of the robber barons. He depended on that establishment for his livelihood. His books were published by Harper & Brothers, a firm that maintained good relationships with wealthy patrons. His lectures were booked through agencies that served the same social circles as the men he wanted to condemn. His home, his family's security, his ability to support himself in old age, all of it depended on maintaining his reputation as a beloved humorist, not as a dangerous radical. But there were others who had tried to speak out and who had been destroyed for it. Eugene Debs, the labor leader, had been sent to federal prison for organizing the Pullman strike of 1894. The strike had been provoked by wage cuts at the Pullman Palace Car Company, while the company continued to charge high rents in the company town where workers were forced to live. When workers struck,
the company hired strikebreakers and convinced President Grover Cleveland to send federal troops to break the strike. Violence erupted. 30 people died. Debs was arrested for contempt of court and sentenced to 6 months in prison. The strike was crushed. The lesson was clear. Challenge corporate power directly, and the full force of the state would be used to destroy you. Mother Jones, the labor organizer, had been arrested more than 20 times for organizing coal miners and textile workers. She was beaten by company guards, threatened with lynching, called the most dangerous woman in America by a West Virginia district attorney. But she persisted, traveling from strike to strike, helping workers organize, speaking at rallies, and documenting the abuse of child labor. She survived only because she was too famous to be quietly murdered, too old to be easily intimidated, and too poor to be worth suing.
She had nothing to lose. Twain, by contrast, had everything to lose: his reputation, his income, his family's future. And so he had made his choice. He would write the truth, but he would not publish it. He would document the crimes of the Gilded Age, but only for posterity. He would be a witness, not a martyr. It was a compromise, and he knew it. In one of his late letters to his friend William Dean Howells, Twain wrote, "I have been dictating some fearful things, for no eye but yours to see, until I have been dead a century, if then. But I got them out of my system, where they have been festering for years, and that was the main thing. I feel better now." Festering for years revealed everything. Twain had not been content with his silence. He had not made peace with his compromise. Every dinner with Rogers, every public appearance, every cheerful article praising American progress had been an act of self-betrayal. And the only way he could live with himself was to write in secret, to document what he knew, to create a record that would outlive him. But writing in secret carried its own risks. Manuscripts could be lost, burned, stolen. Family members could suppress them. Literary executors could edit them beyond recognition. Twain had seen this happen with other writers' posthumous works. He knew that the century-long embargo on his autobiography was only as strong as the people who enforced it. And so he had taken precautions. He had created multiple copies of some documents. He had deposited papers in different locations. He had left instructions with different people. He had created a complex legacy that would take decades to fully sort out. And apparently, he had also left behind documents that even his family did not know about. Documents that had somehow survived for nearly 4 decades after his death, hidden in someone's collection, and had now been delivered to Detective Raymond Schindler. The question was, why now? What had changed in 1947 that made someone decide these documents should finally be revealed? Schindler knew the answer had to be connected to the times they were living in. The Second World War had just ended 2 years earlier. America had defeated fascism, but at enormous cost. And now a new conflict was emerging: the Cold War, a struggle between capitalism and communism, between American democracy and Soviet totalitarianism. In this new context, the old critique of robber baron capitalism suddenly seemed relevant again. The Soviet Union was claiming that American capitalism was exploitative and corrupt. American leaders were defending capitalism as the foundation of freedom and prosperity. And here was Mark Twain, America's most beloved writer, documenting in his own hand how American capitalism had actually functioned during the Gilded Age. The bribery, the monopolies, the worker exploitation, the political corruption. If these documents were published, whose cause would they serve? 3 weeks into his investigation, Schindler finally discovered the source of the manuscript. It had not come from Clara Clemens or from the official archives. It had come from the estate of a man named Albert Bigelow Paine, who had died in 1937, Twain's authorized biographer and literary executor, the man who had sat with Twain during those final dictation sessions and who had controlled access to Twain's papers for 25 years after the author's death. Paine had been a complex figure. He had genuinely admired Twain, had written a 3-volume biography that remained the standard work for decades, and had worked to preserve Twain's legacy. But he had also been a Victorian editor with Victorian sensibilities. He had censored material he considered offensive. He had suppressed writings that might damage Twain's reputation. He had edited the autobiography to remove the most inflammatory passages. He had even taken liberties with the mysterious stranger, substantially rewriting Twain's fragmentary manuscripts to create a publishable narrative. In short, Paine had tried to protect Twain, but in doing so, he had created a sanitized version of the man, a safe and comfortable Mark Twain who fit Victorian expectations of what a great American author should be. But Paine had also been meticulous. He had kept copies of everything, including material he never intended to publish. And when he died, those papers had passed to his heirs, who had kept them in storage for a decade before finally deciding to sell them to collectors. One of those collectors, Schindler discovered, was a retired professor named Marcus Feldstein, who had spent his career studying Gilded Age corruption. Feldstein had purchased a trunk of Paine's papers in 1946, expecting to find mostly correspondence and notes. Instead, he had found the manuscript that Schindler now held, 23 pages of Twain's most bitter denunciations of the robber barons, material that Paine had kept but never shown to Clara Clemens, never included in the official archives, and never mentioned in his biography. Schindler arranged to meet Feldstein in his cramped apartment near Columbia University. The old professor was in his 70s, surrounded by towers of books and file boxes. "I knew it was important when I found it," Feldstein said, carefully pouring tea with shaking hands. "But I'm a scholar, not a publisher. I don't have the connections to get this published properly, and I'm not sure it should be published at all." "Why not?" Schindler asked. "Because it will hurt people. Not the robber barons, they're all dead, but their descendants. The Rockefeller Foundation funds medical research. Carnegie libraries serve communities across the country. Vanderbilt University educates thousands of students. If we publish Twain's condemnations, we tarnish the philanthropic legacies these men created. We make it harder for people to accept their good works." Schindler considered this. "Or we tell the truth. We show that the good works were built on stolen wealth, and we let people decide whether that matters." Feldstein smiled sadly. "And that's why I sent it to you, Mr. Schindler. Because I'm a coward, and you're not. I want the truth to come out, but I don't want to be the one who releases it. So I'm giving you the decision. You can return the manuscript to me, and I'll put it back in storage for another generation. Or you can do what you think is right." Schindler took the manuscript with him when he left. He returned to his office and read it again, slowly this time, weighing every word. And as he read, he understood what Twain had really been trying to say. It was not simply a catalog of crimes, not just a prosecutorial brief against specific men. It was something deeper, a meditation on how good people become complicit in evil systems, how moral compromises accumulate until they define a life, how silence in the face of injustice becomes its own form of participation. Twain had not written this manuscript as an outside observer. He had written it as a participant, as someone who had been saved by a robber baron, who had dined at their tables, who had accepted their charity and their friendship. He had written it as a confession of his own weakness, his own failure to speak out when it mattered most. And in doing so, he had created something more valuable than a simple exposé. He had created a mirror in which America could see itself. Not the mythical America of rugged individualism and unlimited opportunity, but the actual America of concentrated wealth and institutionalized corruption, the America that existed behind the golden facade. Schindler made his decision. He would not publish the manuscript himself. He would not sell it to a newspaper or a magazine. Instead, he would deposit it with the Mark Twain papers at the University of California, Berkeley, where it would be preserved with Twain's other papers, available to scholars, waiting for the day when it would finally be published alongside the rest of the autobiography. He wrote a letter to Professor Feldstein explaining his decision. And then he wrote a longer letter to the curators at Berkeley, explaining the provenance of the manuscript and his reasons for donating it. He included one additional note to be opened when someone finally published the material. The note read, "Mark Twain understood that some truths are too dangerous to speak in their own time, but too important to let die. He wrote for us, for generations he would never meet, trusting that we would be brave enough to hear what his own era could not bear to acknowledge. Do not fail him. Do not sanitize these words or soften their impact. Let them stand as he wrote them, harsh, uncompromising, and true. Because the greatest service we can offer the dead is to take their honesty seriously. And the greatest service we can offer the living is to show them that truth endures even when it must wait a century to be heard." The manuscript remained in the Berkeley archives for decades, exactly as Schindler had intended. It was eventually published in 2015 as part of the third volume of Twain's autobiography, more than a century after his death and 70 years after Schindler received that mysterious envelope. By then, the names Twain had condemned, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, Carnegie, Gould, had become history, their crimes acknowledged, their empires long since broken up by antitrust laws and changing times. But the patterns Twain identified had not disappeared. Corporate monopolies had given way to new forms of concentrated power. Political corruption had evolved new methods. The gap between rich and poor had widened again, reaching levels not seen since the Gilded Age itself. And America still struggled with the same fundamental question Twain had posed. Can a democracy survive when wealth buys power? When the law protects the rich more than the poor? When silence becomes the price of success? Mark Twain had lived through one Gilded Age and documented its crimes for future generations.
He had understood that every era faces the same choice: to speak uncomfortable truths or to maintain comfortable lies, to challenge unjust systems or to accept them as inevitable, to believe that change is possible or to surrender to cynicism. He had made his choice, imperfect though it was. He had written in secret, compromised in public, and trusted that someday someone would care enough to listen. And we are that someday. We are the posterity he wrote for. And the question he leaves us is simple: what will we do with the truth he preserved? Will we hear his witness? Will we learn from his compromises? Will we find the courage he couldn't find in his own lifetime? The courage to speak truth to power while we still live, rather than waiting for the safety of the grave? The envelope that arrived at Detective Raymond Schindler's office in 1947 contained more than just 23 pages of manuscript. It contained a challenge, a test of whether America had finally become the country Twain hoped it might someday be. A nation mature enough to face its own history, honest enough to acknowledge its founders' crimes, and brave enough to build something better on that foundation of truth. That challenge remains open. The test continues. And Mark Twain, wherever he is still waiting for our answer.
This is the story they didn't want you to know. The story of how America's greatest writer spent his final years documenting the truth about the robber barons, the truth about corruption, and the truth about what happens when good people stay silent. But here's what matters now. What are you going to do with this information? Drop a comment below and tell us, what truths do you think are being hidden today? What would Mark Twain write about if he were alive in our time? And if you found this story as powerful as we did, hit that subscribe button and that like button right now, because we're going to keep uncovering the hidden histories that shaped America, the stories that were too dangerous to tell until now, the truths that powerful people hoped would stay buried forever. Thanks for watching, and remember, the truth always endures. It just sometimes has to wait for the right moment and the right audience to finally be heard.